If you were to ask anyone what their favorite console is, you'd get a wide variety of responses, usually something made by Nintendo, Sony, Microsoft, or maybe even Sega. No matter the console, the reasoning is usually the same. They grew up with it. Of course, I'm no different. Being born in 2001, my favorite console is naturally the DS. Even now, as an adult who has the entire world of gaming practically at my fingertips, I still find myself drawn to my favorite DS games. New Super Mario Bros., Pokemon Black White, there's a certain nostalgia to each one of these games that you simply can't replicate once you're older. But oddly enough, my favorite DS games of all time aren't even the ones I grew up with. I bought my first Professor Layton game in 2020. I had just graduated high school the previous year, and due to certain world events wasn't allowed to come into work anymore, so I had a decently high disposable income for a 19-year-old and a lot of free time. One day, my mom sent me a link to a sale on GameStop's online store. Buy 2, get 2 on pre-owned games. A few of the games being offered belonged to a series that I'd heard of but knew nothing about, Professor Layton. I bought one, tried it, and was instantly hooked. The puzzles were addicting, the art was gorgeous, and the stories were exciting and heartfelt. I worked my way through each one in order over the course of the next year. Despite having largely similar gameplay and a very formulaic story structure throughout the series, the atmosphere tied into each respective game brought an undeniably distinct uniqueness to every entry. It was so brilliantly done that the series immediately became one of my absolute favorites of all time alongside Zelda and Metroid. This is all just to say that by all accounts I shouldn't have the same sort of nostalgia for Professor Layton that I do for games I grew up with. I didn't spend nights playing it under a blanket like New Super Mario Bros., I didn't waste countless hours playing it at sleepovers like Minecraft, and yet something about these games feels like I've spent my entire life with them. Something that I've noticed in this series is that the stories tend to place an emphasis on the smaller picture. Most other games tend to prioritize going bigger, louder, more bombastic and powerful as if attempting to top the severity and the situation in each new entry. While Layton is no stranger to this, it almost always uses it as the context or backdrop to what is ultimately a story between a mere handful of characters. Take Unwound Future, for example, the third game in the series, where the high stakes involving the lives and fates of the entire population of London are brushed aside for what is easily the most poignant, memorable, and heartbreaking moments in the entire series. A moment that involves just 2 people in a quiet alleyway with no mentions of these events to be heard. That said, while Unwound Future is naturally my favorite entry like it is for so many others, one entry in particular seems to stand out much more for me in this regard. The very first Professor Layton game, Curious Village. The game takes place in a village called St. Mystere. Throughout the game you are tasked with exploring the village and talking to the various characters, who each have their own quirky personalities and an odd obsession with puzzles. Each side character seems like someone that you would call an oddball in real life, but whom you wouldn't expect to live in a town full of other oddballs. I don't think there's ever been a more apt title for a game than this one, because while the village is far from normal, it sounds much too ostracizing and negative to label it as strange or something similar. It's simply curious. A place that, upon your close inspection, asks more questions than it answers. It piques your interest along with your urge to understand it further, your intellectual curiosity. The game does a phenomenal job of making the village feel foreign yet familiar, like a small town in the middle of nowhere that perhaps you could have made a stop for during a road trip as a kid. From your outside perspective, just looking through your window, it isn't unique in the slightest. There are probably hundreds of them just like it, and after this trip you probably won't even remember its name or the reason you happen to be passing through. But you'll always remember how it felt to be in that place, and you'll easily recall that feeling whenever you visit another place just like it. It's a very specific flavor of nostalgia, one that's not quite the same as replaying a childhood game. A feeling that can more easily be described as realizing that the stranger brushing past you in public has their own life that's just as intricate and complex as yours. This village is so similar to so many other places in so many ways, and yet the story is one that could only be told here in St. Mystere. In 2018, Level 5 released an HD remaster of Curious Village on mobile, and in it they included 2 new cutscenes at the beginning and the end of the game respectively. By that point, the series had long finalized the animation style, which meant that the new cutscenes were noticeably more polished and consistent when compared to those original in the first game. In any other circumstance, I'd probably call this a bad addition just because of how jarring and inconsistent it feels, but in this case, I enjoy them if only because they act as an anchoring point for the rest of the game. You spend so much time secluded to this one area that it's easy to forget that there's a world outside of it. These cutscenes make you step back and remember that this game is a part of a series. The professor in this world is an actual person with a life and a job and relationships, and not 1 but 3 tragic backstories. This is a universe with its own world of archaeological lore and ancient civilizations in various cities, each with their own specific culture. There are major events involving international organized paramilitary crime syndicates and terrorist attacks, and even a brush with a potential apocalypse. And yet, it's a context that exists for the sole purpose of placing emphasis on the fact that the greater world isn't that important. Later games make a habit of letting you travel between various locations, but Curious Village makes an effort to keep you in one place, even dangling the outside world right in front of you at one point, as if to remind you that there is more to this world than the village. And yet it shouldn't matter to you because, well, you're here. We know that London exists in this world, and if we replayed this after the other games, we'd also know that Falsense, Mystere, Monte d'Or, and all the other locations from the series exist outside of these walls too. But in spite of how much of an effect these cities have on the greater population of this world, they don't really matter to the people of St. Mystere all too much. This dissonance is somewhat hard to articulate, but it reminds me of getting home from a long trip and settling back into your own little pocket of normalcy. You were just out and about among hundreds or even thousands of strangers. You were physically part of a crowd, of a collective where everything is in plain view of those around you. You've seen parts of the world that you'd never seen in the past, and your own perspective of the world has changed as a result. Now you're back home, a place very few others will ever experience. Everything within your home has some sort of reason to be there, a story behind it that you and you alone know the origin of. You might even take comfort in the fact that it's something that most likely will never affect or be affected by anyone other than yourself. You know in your mind that the rest of the world still exists, but it feels so distant from the world you've created for yourself that it might as well just be a work of fiction. The very last scene before the credits roll is of the professor driving away with his apprentice, Luke, and another girl they met in their journey, Flora. Luke asks the professor if he plans to inform the press of the events they had witnessed during their time in St. Mystere, to which Layton responds,
"No, Luke. St. Mystere's secret must stay between us."
Huh? Why do you say that?
You see, my dear boy, we don't want people to make a spectacle of Flora. That wouldn't be right.
Of course. Always thinking of others.
Well, one must always put a lady's needs first. That's what a gentleman does.
On a surface level, this can be read as a final showcase of the professor's personality and moral code, but to me it places one last emphasis on what I think is the most compelling aspect of the game's atmosphere and tone. There was a story here. A story of mystery, of intrigue, of danger, and most importantly, of everlasting and undying love. It's a love that's given and received from these villagers, a love that still has sentimental value to a select few people and therefore isn't worth throwing away. The sense of love and belonging in this game and in this village are something that most outsiders wouldn't even begin to understand, which makes it unique to a point that showcasing it for all to see would ultimately ruin what makes it so special. The nostalgia of Curious Village doesn't come from our memories of playing the game. It comes from the memories we have of the small world we've created for ourselves and the people we share it with.